Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We have a lot to cover today, so before I hand it over to our speakers, just a couple of housekeeping rules. We'll be recording today's webinar and it will be available on onetrust.com/resources in the next few days. And if you noticed, everyone joined today's webinar muted, so if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A window. On that note, I'll hand it over to Matt to kick things off for us.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So just quick introductions. Matt Moog, General Manager of our third-party risk offering, and I'm joined here by John Stile. Let you give an introduction to yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. John Stile. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at HackNotice. Came on a little while ago and really interested in third-party risk management and our partnership here with OneTrust. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, John. So go through our today's agenda, and we have our the chat open as well. So if you guys have any questions as we go through this about really any topic relative to this item, feel free to put it in the chat. We'll break into that as we go through. But I want to talk about the third-party risk management landscape, specific cut around cybersecurity activities. We'll then kind of go into things around third-party data breaches and incident response, and then we'll wrap with a couple of key takeaways and question and answer. And if anyone has any questions, again, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I see someone maybe getting an echo. I don't see an echo from our perspective. So the business resilience is the ability of an organization has to quickly adapt to disruptions and maintain continuous business operations while safeguarding people, assets, and overall brand equity. I see business resiliency as more of a muscle. We typically say that you have to kind of plan for it, but you also have to live through it. Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I truly believe the activity of resiliency is kind of something you need to live and you need to experience. So as we go through some of the topics here, especially with respect to cyber, breaches, incidents, things like that, just keep that in mind from a business resiliency perspective, and really the ability to kind of plan for and live through and prep through these incidents as you would a kind of normal business operations. Always enables you to react quicker. And I'm sure any good cyber leader would tell you it's not about if but when from an incident perspective, and being definitely prepped for that, like practice for any sport, certainly key to that. I want to turn it maybe over to John on a couple different pieces, and kind of kick us off here with some of the data-driven mindset. I know that if you go back 10 years ago, the access to data around things like privacy or cyber or resiliency, financial health, things like that, really was one, hard to get to, two, maybe unreliable in many cases. And the advancement of that data has certainly grown by leaps and bounds. But John, I want to just ask questions around like how do you see your clients really embracing that data-driven mindset? What concerns and issues do they have, and how they kind of overcome those?
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely seen a big shift in the last years of data-driven decision-making, that mindset really becoming reliant upon the data. Now we can no longer think about that. I get the good feels of this customer or this vendor, this third party. We have the data at hand. I think we have gotten closer to being over the hump of we have too much data. We're really using data governance, the tools that we've had in the past, and applying it to this plethora of data that we have at hand and making much better decisions. It allows for collaboration without bias, which is fantastic. And I think that that's huge. And then allows us to continually learn, because every model we bring in of cyber data makes us just a little bit better in the next decision that we make. So it's not only a data-driven mindset of today, but it's a data-driven mindset of tomorrow, and how we're feeding the future and making those decisions about our vendors, which is fantastic and a great move I've seen. I mean, at first it was, I don't know if you remember these days, but it was, all right, let's pull out an Excel spreadsheet and scorecard. I like it. This is a 1, 2, or 3 on these 7 questions we have about a vendor. Now we have 17 questionnaires, and it's show me the source of data. What did they score? It was a 98.3279, and we can make that data-driven decision without bias. It's been a big shift, and we're still getting our hands around it. I'm not saying we're there, but it's been something I've seen over the past few years, and it's been great. So I like to see it.
Yeah, and I mean the point that you made around kind of spreadsheets and kind of the data allows you to react to things as they happen in real time. I think I said 2 years ago that in 3 years, you know, assessments and spreadsheets, you know, will have significantly subsided. I don't think they'll ever go away fully. I think there's certainly value in the ability to just collect information around control structures and policies and things that matter, especially as you're entering into a relationship and you're getting to know someone. It's almost like reading a resume before entering into an interview.
100%, absolutely.
Right. But you know, that number, I think with respect to data comes significantly down. And, you know, I'm sure you see a lot of your clients leaning a lot more into data and saying, instead of just knee-jerk reaction, sending out a questionnaire to get information, especially for a vendor, maybe you've sent out that questionnaire for 10 straight years, the ability to kind of put them into a stage of maturity and then lean more into the data and react to the data as things happen, even if it's just a discussion for a false positive, seems to be, you know, the way most organizations are starting to go, and kind of having that almost like assessment last mindset and all the other data points, you know, first, so that that's more of like an ongoing real-time relationship they have with a third party.
Absolutely. We definitely went from a shift of, you know, let's look at a one-time security posture and let's look at the data around it, right? Do they have any open vulnerabilities? Let's fix that. Okay, now we have a partnership and we're good to go. Then we moved into let's send the assessment once a year and we look at that maturity over time. Now we're able to look at it in real time. We're able to look at it, you know, every day, every couple hours, make that continual assessment. But what's also interesting is we fed it back to the front side when they're doing the assessment. They're going to look at a time period of the past 5 years. It's not just that point in time when we're signing the vendor on and we're looking at their third-party risk. We're adding it to our continuous evolution of risk management and continuous monitoring.
Yeah, John, great point. And I think organizations also sometimes forget that they have wealth of information themselves. Even if you go back and look at spreadsheets and results and issues and closures and things like that, the trending of the relationship with a vendor combined with information from a company like HackNotice can become incredibly powerful about trying to predict where, you know, risk events may be more susceptible.
Yes, absolutely. And gives a good picture into their overall risk profile as they're a company looking to get better, or they're a company that's looking to stay stagnant, or they're at such an exceptional growth rate that, you know, they're finding all sorts of new holes every which way, and you might have a risk there, right? So you can use the data to your advantage.
Yeah. So I'll jump around here on some of these topics. And again, you know, feel free for anyone who wants to add questions in the chat, for those of you who have just joined. But, you know, it seems like every 3 years, some of these topics come up and they become big focal points and then they kind of go away, and they become big focal points and go away. Certainly concentration risk is one of those items, but wanted to dive into the management of nth parties and kind of how you can use data to get a little bit more intelligence around that extended, you know, fourth, fifth, sixth party landscape.
Well, yeah. So I think on the nth parties, it's become exceptionally easier to gather this data now. You know, we just got off the data topic, but in the monitoring, now we can expand continually to nth parties, right? Before it was, how do we get all this data? How do we understand who those nth parties are? How do we actually manage them from just a project or program perspective, right? Understanding who all they are. That was a huge challenge just up until a couple of years ago. Now we understand how to manage them from a program perspective, and now we're able to get a lot better about our concentration risk, understand the regulatory scrutiny, go that next level down, because we've solved the first problem.
Yeah, and getting into that nth parties, I mean, I think it becomes a daunting task. Anyone who's ever tried to map, you know, third, fourth, fifth, it's just exponential growth. You know, do you have any, I guess, lessons learned or tips for people who are just embarking on that understanding of like, where should I start?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to hit on this a little bit later, but I'll bring it up here. It's really all about understanding the criticality of the data, the importance of it from your own perspective, your customer's perspective. Is it a source of data? What is the business process? How does it fit holistically into the ecosystem? And picking your low-hanging fruit that's high impact, right? We always talk about that high impact, high value, easy to get. You got to start somewhere, and really understanding the landscape first is what allows us to do that.
Awesome. And maybe jumping around again, looking specifically around cybersecurity and threats. I think for years, third party risk has really been what I would consider as a reactive type of an environment, and understanding kind of the threat landscape and kind of being proactive and more on the front foot. How do you see organizations leveraging your data to really try to be proactive around their risk management activities?
Yeah, I think that this is one that's come up. I think back to one of the big ones a couple of years ago, when SolarWinds was breached. Not to mention a specific one, but that really led us down the path of looking at supply chain much more closely and understanding it. So those threats in the cybersecurity landscape allowed us to really focus our attention on those supply chain vectors, and understand that every single one of those has the exact same problems we're dealing with on a daily basis as a company. So if I'm dealing with ransomware, my supply chain's dealing with ransomware. If I'm dealing with phishing, I know my supply chain's dealing with phishing, right? So it really brought a different perspective, and really provided us that understanding that we do have to, put a lens on it, because they're so business critical.
Yep. And then kind of taking that, I mean, with cybersecurity and incident management, I go all the way back to the mortgage crisis in 2008, and how much third party got elevated over the next 3 years after that portion, due to customer conduct, especially in financial services. But then you start to look at the pandemic and the stress that was put on markets, and the war in Ukraine and the stress that put on supply chains. So you start looking at other sectors outside of highly regulated sectors, and third-party risk is really becoming a pervasive board topic. How do you see organizations talking about this in a way that boards can understand it?
Yeah, I think it goes all back to understanding your ecosystem from that high level, being able to present it at that level, and being cognizant of it. What I've seen in mature organizations is you have a level of trust with the board. They want to understand. But being able to prove your processes at a lower level, they'll trust the reports on the top side, right? So we are going through things like SOC 2, we're going through HIPAA compliance, PCI, all the regulations, all the regulatory aspects are providing some of that insight to the board from a technical and operational perspective. And then as they fit into the business model and these stressors, kind of play against your business, you can map them to those regulations and say, look, the geopolitical concerns hit, we are focusing our cybersecurity infrastructure on threats from a certain part of the world, so on and so forth. And understanding that your controls in place will take care of some of these items is real key to a board.
Excellent. And then one of the things I've seen kind of organizations get challenged with, I'll jump back onto the left-hand side with respect to cross-team information sharing, is, we see organizations that are kind of fully centralized with third-party risk programs, and then some organizations fully decentralized. I was at a conference last week, and I was absolutely shocked at the number of organizations that have kind of fully moved towards centralization. I kind of prefer hybrid, where you have some flexibility, where centralized governance, maybe some decentralized operations, but singular technology to kind of pull everything together. I know at OneTrust we provide capabilities to look at risk domains, across information security and finance and legal and privacy and resiliency. How do you see organizations pulling data from all those different parts of the organization kind of centrally, so that they get a full picture of risk with respect to those third-party relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think back to previous organizations I've been at and how we implemented it here at HackNotice. It's really about partnership at the top level, coming to agreement on exactly what you were talking about, that single pane of glass tooling. So all the data is available to you. All the data is available there. It's transparent is one of the keys, right? You have to be transparent across those silos. Across the hybrid organization, you need that transparency, because it's a trust but verify, right? That centralized management can do the verification, but we trust you to do the work because you know that line of business better than a centralized team would. So I think the singular tooling is an interesting place to start because it does provide that single pane of glass.
Yeah, and I also think kind of pulling everything into a single pane of glass, the ability to really do risk management versus what I would consider compliance activities.
Yes.
I see so many organizations that say, I have 500 assessments. I need to get through these 500 assessments. Those assessments create issues. I need to manage those issues, as opposed to understanding, well, what data do I have that might actually be acceptable in place of an assessment? And at the same time, can I use that data to set appetites, and can I be alerted when it goes outside of those appetites? And can I actually do a degree of risk management? I think success for any organization is to show that they've actually reacted to what's happening either across macro factors or with respect to individual third parties, and being able to show, here's how we managed a degree of risk that was back within an appetite. Do you see organizations really leaning into the data you guys provide to really create that level of appetite?
Absolutely. And I think that the reason being is we try to create an easy to use data set that and platform that companies can come in and really look at the data in a transparent way and understand it, and it puts context around it. So you can provide some of exactly what you were talking about.
Excellent. So maybe we'll switch to the next piece, and really just wanted to get your perspectives on how organizations understand threats.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you'll see here a list of a number of threats, and there are so many threats within this listing here. Ransomware as a service is one that pops out that has come out more recently than some of the others. One of the ones we always forget about is employees, right? And you have obviously bad actors internally, but also non-malicious employees. I know I've had security incidents in the past where somebody accidentally, they were trying to type, I think, Mike or somebody at the company, and they accidentally emailed it to an ex spouse of theirs, and it was social security numbers, etc. It's completely innocent. They thought they were being innocent, and you really have to focus on each of these key components and solve them, but look at them in an overall risk structure for a company and organization. So phishing and malware, they go hand in hand. Ransomware as a service is going to go hand in hand, right? You hire ransomware as a service, they're going to get in through phishing, utilizing malware. You, through your employees, potentially take advantage of IoT devices. And once they understand your security tools and processes, they may have ways around them. So I think that taking into context each of these individually and solving them, but then looking at them at a higher level to understand an entire risk profile is important.
Excellent. So diving maybe into one of these specifically, I've seen focus on ransomware. What does HackNotice mean by ransomware as a service?
Yeah, so ransomware as a service is where you're going to potentially go to one of these gangs. Big one recently was Klopp was in the news because of the Move It breach. You're going to these different organizations and you're going to say, I need X amount of data. I'll front this as a project, and they're going to use the tools and with malicious intent go after different organizations on your behalf. So it's a very interesting agreement where the ransomware gangs are operating on behalf of other organizations.
Excellent. And I know one of the larger topics that we're dealing with, with large language models and generative AI is kind of how AI is playing a role, specifically influencing some of these activities. Have you seen any changes in stance of focus just based on how AI is impacting any of these 6 topics?
Yeah, we see it. We see it in a number of things. One, we've seen a number of organizations that have looked at AI and using AI as a service. You think of OpenAI or any of the major tools out there. Obviously, ChatGPT is making the biggest rounds, but employees providing sensitive data there. So you have a data protection and a data loss issue. So that's a problem that we've seen, brand new emergence. I think the first report of that was back in probably April with one organization. Some countries have shut it down. As we look at phishing and malware, we're looking at more advanced phishing campaigns and actually targeting. Spear phishing has become less of a single entity that you're going after, and you can almost generate spear phishing level emails in a grand phishing campaign across thousands and thousands of users within seconds. So AI has definitely changed the way we're looking at those two. And as we look at security tools and processes, I think that in cybersecurity, we don't necessarily focus on the infrastructure tooling, but there have been AI generated tools that are doing pen testing, that are pulling out vulnerabilities and automatically looking for those attack vectors.
Excellent. So with all that complexity, how do we focus in on what good cybersecurity hygiene looks like?
Yeah, so I love this. I love this slide. I think that it shows kind of what has to be done and what should be done, right? That's the way I think of this. And really, from a legislative model, I look at that as these are the things that we have to check the box on compliance. Cybersecurity hygiene is what's going to give you that true business value at the end of the day. What are you trying to accomplish with regard to your brand recognition, reputation? What are you trying to do from an infrastructure protection perspective, business continuity, all of that? So you're going above and beyond and tailoring it to a niche for your business in a way that makes sense. And these two don't live mutually exclusively, right? You can be extremely clean from a cybersecurity perspective, and it may look a little different than the legislative model one-to-one mapping, but you can meet those controls while at the same time doing better for your business and getting that one step up, getting one step ahead. Obviously, you're never 100% fully protected, but in a cybersecurity hygiene model, you're really tailoring how you're responding to cybersecurity challenges to meet your business needs so you don't hinder it.
Excellent. So maybe dive a little bit deeper into data breaches and incident response, kind of a data point to frame some of the discussion around. 59% of orgs that suffered their first software supply chain attack did not have a response strategy. And kind of like I said before, plan to get punched in the face, it's not if, but when. I think organizations, fail to routinely practice what this looks like. And, I see organizations say, oh, we did a tabletop exercise 2 years ago. But with the pace of change of the threat landscape, and with the pace of change of, how infrastructures are being moved into the cloud, and how that scenario can change drastically, how do you see organizations changing how they prepare for how to respond to an attack like this?
Yeah, and I'll make a real quick antidote on this quote. I think that this is interesting. The 59% of orgs didn't have a response strategy. I'd also be very interested in the percentage of those orgs that did have one. How many had never tried it before? How many tried to see if it worked before it didn't? So leading into that, I think that I'm seeing more and more push towards tabletop exercises. Oftentimes in the compliance world, at least in my experience in the financial services, we did a lot of theoretical run through the experience. We had outside participants who would present the scenarios for us, and you had full participation from everybody, buy-in from the top down. So I think that those tabletop exercises are a great way to stress it, but you're having 50,000 vendors, you're not going to be able to do it for all. So I think that one of the keys is to use the tools that are available to us to effectively develop this response strategy and provide enough flexibility for it to adapt to the situations of your business. And just know you're not going to get it right the first time.
That's certainly true. So you mentioned that kind of 50,000, the daunting aspect of scale. There's an interesting comment in the chat. Now I'll just read it, and John would like your perspectives on it. But someone said, I regularly evaluate 25,000 web pages on my site to ensure third-party vendor hosted scripts are not pulling more data than what was approved. They don't have the time to review every vendor page, but how do they increase confidence that only approved vendors and data are being loaded and pulled in those relationships?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple ways to approach this problem from our perspective. One is obviously in the initial sign on, et cetera, you need the legalese, all of that aspect that goes into an onboarding of that. But in addition, the usage of that data-driven intelligence. So how many of those that are hosting scripts can you gather data on, and in an automated way, in a data warehouse, in a data lake, use that data to provide automated analysis of that is a key. I know that data warehouses, in my past experience, have been petabytes of data constantly being churned through by machines overnight, and it gets costly, but it is fast and efficient from a computational perspective to do it in that way, as opposed to manpower. So I would really focus on automation of that, and using those data feeds, data components that we have built into infrastructure already to help accomplish those goals.
Excellent. Kind of shifting topics a little bit here, but when I started back in third-party risk, we all called it vendor risk, and then it was third-party, and had a number of names to it. But and I won't date myself and tell you when it was, but we always focused on, there's a vendor, and then we started to get into understanding of, well, are there different engagements, and are there different risks? How are these services being delivered? Are the products and services different? Sometimes you might have software with services in the same type of a contract, and then you get down to the individual assets that might be in play as far as where data is being held, how it's being managed. So the complexity here starts to really go deep in terms of understanding what risks are really apparent in either the relationship as a whole, when you look at things like beneficial ownership, ABAC risk, sanctions screening, things like that, or then going down into the individual products or services and the risks that they may have around cyber or resiliency or privacy or compliance or SaaS or customer facing. I mean, there's an ever growing number of risks that are available. But how does HackNotice enable the ability to really drill down into those relationships and not just look at that macro environment for a vendor, but be able to kind of understand where some of those issues are happening relative to services, locations, assets, things like that?
Yeah, we have a number of tools at our disposal from the data that we've gathered and continually gather in a real-time basis from the dark web, published sources, all of that. We can really focus on one, not just the vendor, what their overall profile looks like, but what do the individuals within that organization look like? We had hit on employees being an attack vector or a threat. How are those employees having credentials out on the dark web? How are we responding to those incidents as a vendor? And so really focusing on providing the tools that not only look at maybe just your domain, but also your ancillary domains, your third-party domains. How are the employees, the end users, really playing a part in what data is out there about your company and your organization?
Yeah. And I mean, to the point you just made, I spent the last 20 years in New York. There used to be a commercial that came on around 10 o'clock. It said, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your kids are? And I always kind of laugh at that relative to, well, my kids go to bed at 8 o'clock. So I hope I know where my kids are at 10. But I always used to kind of relate that to data. It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your data is? And I remember doing a project a long time ago for a very large bank, and we took all of the vendors that had customer facing data and we traced the data as far as it would go. And I would tell anyone on this webcast that if you haven't done that, at least for your critical relationships, and probably at least for anyone who's handling customer data from a privacy perspective, it is a very good activity to do. And I think you're going to find some interesting things. We found 50% of the fourth, fifth. We found a couple of sixth parties. I haven't found a seventh, but if you do, please call me. Love to know, how that went down. But we found about 50% of those fourth parties were actually already third parties to the organization. So the amount of risk management that was already being done on those fourth parties was kind of already available, and being able to relate activities that were done from a third party risk perspective down to the fourth parties. We also saw data that was leaving organizations where they were maybe unaware of how that data was even being used. So data that was maybe going to a subservice provider, where that subservice provider was aggregating data across their client base and using that for marketing material or other types of activities. But when you start to look at the strengthening of privacy laws and use of data, and this the significant risk of fines relative to preference and consent, it really starts to make you think, like, are you very comfortable that you know where your data is, and you know how your third parties are handling that data, and you know if it's going beyond that third party into a fourth party. Are you seeing organizations think differently about that specific portion of their risk management program?
Yeah, so I'll add one more to your list though first, and it's really also about the data that you're sending that they don't need. The amount of data that we say, well, this report looks a lot like what they need, it just has some extra columns. What do I care, right? And you send it over, and now that one feed becomes a 2-vendor feed. Now it becomes a 12-vendor feed, and it's a 30-vendor feed before you know it. And all of a sudden, everybody has the exact same data when all they really needed was, columns A and C. So I think that's really interesting, and that's where a lot of those data loss prevention tools have come in play, to look at that aspect. But I think that you're exactly right. The amount of data that you end up seeing out there. I know when I got on the HackNotice tooling and started using it against myself just to see what data was even out there, forget a vendor, forget a large multinational. I mean, I'm looking at data from myself that I honestly had kind of forgotten about, and it's still out there, but I guarantee you it's still linked to something. And it helps me build that relationship of, where did this data come from? Where did it go? And having context of the data helps build that relationship. So we see companies using our tooling to do that, and say, hey, it looks like so-and-so signed up with their corporate email address for this meetup group. Meetup got breached. Now we have something to worry about.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on one point, John, that I think in the first meeting we ever had with HackNotice, it was a very interesting perspective of the data you don't expect to be exposed. And
yes,
where organizations, you get an email, you go sign up for something, you put your corporate email in there, maybe you use the same password, because a lot of people use similar passwords for everything. But that exposure is almost exponential, because you have a number of employees, that they may have signed up from multiple sites, but I don't see a lot of organizations really focusing on that from a hygiene perspective, to make sure that their employees are in line with their corporate policies around use of their corporate email. How does HackNotice really provide that information and intel to be able to help organizations act on that?
Yeah, I think in roles past, it's really been check the box compliance that we talked about earlier, where it's, yes, I gave the training. Yes, I did this certain thing. Yes, I did this to make sure they signed the policy, right? There was never enforcement of it. There was never monitoring. There was never any of that. By having the tools readily accessible and easy for the security teams to use, monitoring becomes a 30-second part of their day. It doesn't become I need to go dig through my SIM, I need to go dig through these logs, and I need to go look and see, or I need to go get on their email account, see what's going on, et cetera. You have it in almost real time. And by having that data available, you can not only understand that the data is out there, but you can also provide the training that's relevant in 2 minutes, just focused on that singular topic, that they're going to retain. They're going to say, oh, that actually happened to me. And it becomes personal.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, that's a lot more important to the individual. So you're solving two birds with one stone, right? You're lowering the barrier to find the problem, and two, to remediate the problem, you're providing high quality, valuable content for that individual.
Yeah, and do you guys see a degree of correlation between things like breach risk or exposure and propensity or higher or lower propensity of users using their corporate email on external sites?
So I don't know that I have exact data on it, but I think that we have seen the aha moment that becomes publicly available, right? So we're at least getting the aha moment. I don't have the data on how much it's lessened the use of corporate, but I would even say, regardless whether they use corporate or not, and that's why for a lot of organizations we offer employee monitoring for their personal items, is they may share it across both, right? And if I'm John at hacknotice.com and I'm John at Gmail, I could use the same password across both. It could be an easy correlation to get right across, right?
Yeah.
So providing that in a secure and safe way that's abstracted from the corporation to reduce liability, but at the same time gives you insight for your employees to prevent data breaches.
Yeah. And I was kind of asking that as an intro to this slide. I'm sure anyone who's a fan of The Office has seen the episode where, they're running around the office going, what's the procedure? What's the procedure? And, there's, I think as organizations look at this, the disruption event, the third party, your company, and then kind of everything to the right is what people are kind of used to. Where I think organizations need to focus a bit more on from a proactive perspective is that yellow box, that signs of stress. And you guys collect a wealth of information and data. Where do you typically see those signs of stress, or are there areas that, as you look at a breach or an event or an incident and you kind of have that aha moment, as you mentioned before, are there areas within the data set that typically might be indicative of stress on an organization?
Yeah, we're absolutely seeing signs of stress as employees' data is released onto the dark web or other sources of data. We are seeing that as potential leading indicator of that hygiene of an organization. And it's not a one-to-one, right? You may see an increase because it just happened to, you only had 5 records out there before and now you have 10. That's 100% increase. Well, yeah, that's a big increase, but your count set was pretty small. I think that we do see, though, some of those signs of stress as data gets out there about an organization. They become more and more in the news. They become more and more of a target because data's out there about them, right? You have to imagine the same data that we are seeing on the risk management side, the hackers are seeing too, right? They're trying to gather that same data and use it just the opposite way. So as we see that data come out and those hotspots, we're seeing that as a potential leading indicator to at least a problem, a breakdown in the procedure. May not cause a disruption event, but it is a breakdown in procedure and adds to the overall risk of a vendor.
Yeah, and I think refocusing also on the signs of stress. When I was back in consulting and talking to clients around what they saw relative to an incident or a breach, there were typically signs of stress that some you may see in breach data, some you may see in control structure, and those are kind of the normal pieces. But I think interestingly enough, we saw other signs of stress that would never be captured unless you actually had more of like a quarterly or monthly or annually review of the relationship as a whole. When you start looking at like financial stress in a marketplace or on an individual organization, when you start looking at attrition, when you see leadership changeovers and things like that, sometimes that can put stress on an organization. We even saw areas where there was degradation in how the services were being provided, and it may have been just slight, but you see degradation over a period of time, and then all of a sudden there was an outage or a breach or something else that happened. So I think at least my lesson learned in seeing and doing root cause on a lot of these incidents is you have to look at the full picture, and you have to have an understanding and frankly a discussion with those third parties to understand where those signs of stress exist. That may not be a situation where an event actually does occur, but if you have 10 vendors where you see signs of stress and you have their contact information and maybe you're checking in with them on a monthly basis, that enables you to have a better finger on the pulse, and maybe if an incident does happen, you're better able to react to that. So talk to me a little bit about the right side of this slide, as far as what happens relative to events, and kind of what happens when those incidents occur.
Yeah, so I've always been of the mindset that anything that's involving this type of organization, a data event of this caliber is always a Sev 0 or a Sev 1, right? And it's all hands on deck. So no single silo within this can solve the problem. I love coming from the IT side saying, hey, we'll take care of everything, don't worry about it. But it really is a team effort, and it requires every single one of these parts of the organization to be in the response, be part of that. And I talked about those tabletop exercises, right? Anytime we run them, anytime we do them, it's everybody. It's understanding your role, your responsibility, and having those clearly defined, and having the communication platforms in order to enable that to happen in both a timely and efficient manner, and with high quality. So, there are silos to get things operationally and procedurally done, but this is a team effort to holistically solve the disruption event.
Yep. So kind of moving to a slightly different topic, but evergreen threat intelligence, and kind of a couple thought-provoking questions here, but what tools and technologies exist so kind of identify that? Where are you guys pulling data from? Where do you see the most value in the data sets that you guys are currently looking at?
Yeah, so we have a lot of different data sets. They're continually running 24/7, gathering new data as it comes out. There's the dark web from ransomware gangs. There's data from official sources. There's different discussion groups that have data in them. There's news sources. There's a lot of available data out there from a reporting perspective on threat intelligence. So we use a multitude of those sources, and it's really hard to capture them in a single tool. We've done and do what we can, but we have teams that are constantly looking for those new sources of data. So we use everything from scraping data off the web to using APIs. Any source we can get data from, we're using that as again, integrating into our infrastructure to pull it into a normalized data set that then you can use to present to customers of what is going on. So obviously, Clop ransomware as an organization does not present data in the same way that the state of Delaware does. So we're using that, normalizing it, and adding machine learning on top of it to understand what the data means in order to provide the context for it to be presented to customers.
Yeah,
so,
and I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Oh no, go right ahead. I was just going to say, machine learning is kind of key there, and just the plethora of data sources, and then having a normalization capability has been key to the success of our data.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to touch on the learning model pieces that you just mentioned, and I feel like there's a need that we see a breach, then we go backwards in time and we say, what happened? What were the leading indicators? How could we get ahead of this? And that seems to be like the perpetual cycle of just dealing with incidents as they occur. With the evolution of AI and just the swath of data just continuing to exponentially explode, I mean, do you foresee in the next 12, 24 months, the ability for organizations really to kind of turn that more towards a predictive type of a view with respect to that data?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that you can take all of those risk factors that on the last slide talk about those signs of stress, and you can start to build that model. I mean, I think we can conceptually do it. How we build that into an actual AI model is the next hurdle and leap. We can look at it and kind of from a gut feel check. We've looked at this data enough to understand that there's a leading indicator there. How do we form that into the model is the next hurdle and leap. And I definitely see it coming about with the way AI has progressed in the past. I mean, even 6 months, it's becoming easier and easier to feed that data in. The key is going to be, how do we build the model, and then how do we feed the data in real time enough? And with our normalized data structure, I think that we have the capability to do it. It becomes exactly what you're talking about, a predictive model or predictive analytics for those data breaches.
Yeah. And then maybe jumping down to this third question here, I absolutely love this one, but what can the past breach history teach us about a company's risk profile?
Yeah, I look at this, and I don't know how you look at it, but I really look at it as a time scale, right? I love to break things into buckets of long-term, medium-term, short-term. Everybody does. Right, from a long-term breach history, it's going to give us, how does a company respond, right? Are they on the trajectory to getting better? Is their hygiene becoming cleaner? Are they making progress towards getting better? In the short term, it may tell us that there's a breach that's imminent, right? All of a sudden we see a lot of credentials from a certain organization showed up on a Monday. Well, more, possibly by Friday, they're going to be in a situation that has caused a data incident, right? So kind of looking at it short term, long term, I think gives us different data, both equally important.
Yeah, I mean, I see organizations, it's almost like studying the relationship, again, going back to the, if it's not if, it's when, but the ability to kind of unpack a breach, what happened, what was the root cause, what did you learn from it, how did you respond to it, were you clear and crisp around communications, did you learn from it, are you stronger because you went through the experience? You almost look at an organization, that may have some degree of risk, maybe not a breach history, but or maybe not even an incident history, but try to find a way to understand how they have an ability to react to it if they've never actually gone through it. And
Right.
Certainly a clean bill of health is what we want for every organization. But I do think that there's huge learning moments for organizations to become a lot stronger, should they take the right actions post an incident or a breach, to make sure that they learn from the experience.
Absolutely. And I think that communication, you hit on an interesting point there. The communication coming out of a breach really tells you what kind of vendor they are from a risk management and risk tolerance perspective. Are they public about it? How are they reacting to it? What are they doing in response to is a big learning that may not be captured in all the data, but is key to risk management.
Yeah. And kind of similar going into this slide, I really like the title here, the transition from compliance to continuous monitoring, and kind of the ability to understand, well, what did we learn in the past? For years, third-party risk was one of those things where, if you ever seen the movie Groundhog Day, Bill Murray waking up, it's the same thing over and over and over again. And for years, we would send blank spreadsheets back to the same provider that you've done assessments for the last 5 to 10 years. And it was almost like this, oh, not again, not again. But this transition from that kind of compliance activity really into continuous monitoring really leans into the aspects and the need for data. I'm a big proponent of saying we need to go to a very uncomfortable place in order to get a little bit more comfortable. We have to make assumptions on appetite so that we focus in the right areas from a risk management standpoint, and then we're not caught in the I just got to get through the 500 things model, which is more akin to that Groundhog Day piece. You deal with a lot of organizations. How do you see organizations dealing with this transition? Are you still seeing a little bit of fear with respect to the data? Are you still seeing hesitancy?
Yeah, I think it's hesitancy in two aspects. One is, how do I trust the data? Because if you think about it, some of the data is coming from the dark web. How many people have seen YouTube videos or news articles about the dark web and how terrible it is, et cetera? But there's a plethora of data out there that you have to be cognizant of. So, understanding the data and taking it as another source of information there's hesitancy there. And then the other is in the accountability aspect of it. I think one of the biggest challenges we had in some of the organizations that I've worked for is being allowed to take accountability for something and saying this is a bigger problem than we know, or with the data that we have, we need to focus on this more. You're putting a spotlight on yourself and not setting yourself up for it's either win or lose, but thanks for bringing it to our attention and let's focus on it. So, not being that squeaky wheel, right?
Yeah, and Jens is making a good point in the chat here, and I know it's something I've talked with your colleague Paul about on several occasions. But he said it presumes that companies reveal that they've had a breach. Most companies will conceal their breaches from the public, so it will skew the results. I know I've talked to Paul on several occasions where you've talked to a potential client or someone else, and about breach history that maybe they've not disclosed before. So tell me a little bit more about it. I just want to pull on that thread a little bit.
Yeah, so absolutely, there is a hesitancy to come out and say that something had happened, because it never looks positive in the news when you're breached. But I think that two things: it's becoming more and more available in the public space to get that information due to regulations. You see the big news about one of the rideshare apps. They didn't disclose their breach and they got fined. Potential was up for potential jail time, things like that. So you're having more and more sources that are forcing the reporting, but for those that don't, I think it's the data can still be out there. And it's in places that are very hard to find. So that's why it doesn't get revealed in the news, things like that. But our platform is going after places that the news isn't going to go, right? We're going to go find out. And very seldom is a ransomware gang going to say, hey, we breached this organization, and them not, just for the fun of it, right? They have a reputation to uphold within the dark web community, right? So, if you look at that, we're getting some more information from companies that may not have seen it, or we see those signs of stress and it gives us an indication that there was potentially a breach, and the organization has in the past come out to us and said, yeah, we did, but it's small enough, we were able to contain it, it was internal only, something like that.
Yeah. There's one question in the chat that I'll just touch on real quickly. Yakima, how often would you recommend performing third-party assessments on vendors? I go back, a decade ago, and we used to say, well, high risk is annually and medium risk is every 2 years. My perspective is, when you're entering into a relationship, get as much information on that organization as possible. Once you have that, and that kind of goes akin to this, screen, assess, review, and then that continuous risk and oversight is, make it risk-based. Put appetites in the stand. If you can get an understanding of what residual risk looks like, if you can get an understanding of what your appetite looks like relative to security ratings, if you can get an understanding of certain types of events that would create an incident or the reestablishment of an activity, programs should be flexible enough, especially with the technological capabilities and the data that's available in the marketplace, to be able to stop this. Like, every year I have to go do this thing. I just see diminishing returns. I mean, we saw an organization that was probably 20% of their assessments were on site, and then COVID happened, and they realized they could do enhanced due diligence from a remote perspective. They cut their travel budget by 90%, and they put all of their critical enterprise critical vendors into a 3-year on-site rotation, and everything else is done remotely. And they're even thinking about going back and looking at the previous history results and data and saying, I'm going to put some of these relationships into what we consider a mature stage. We're going to touch base with them quarterly from a relationship standpoint. We're going to monitor these specific feeds, and we're going to react when something falls out of an appetite. And I think that's a really good approach for an organization, certainly in mature thinking. And those of you in highly regulated environments, that is a highly regulated organization, but they're working with their internal auditors, they're working with their regulators, and they're trying to really drive, how do we look at risk management in a different lens?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll hit on one. I think that in my experience, it's COVID opened up more of an opportunity for it to become a push environment where they're pushing, we're doing these things, here's the continuous monitoring. You don't need to come because I sent you the report every month, even though you used to do it only once a year. And it's just a dashboard, right? And trusting that process, COVID kind of opened that opportunity, and it's been an interesting shift.
Yep. And then there was another question here around and I'll toss it over to you, John. Can the breach narrative be framed as a learning opportunity as opposed to being judgmental? Would that even help with the breach reporting? I think we touched a little bit on it, but maybe expand.
100%. It's any breach is a learning opportunity. I will tell you, in the heat of the moment, you're not going to say that. You're not going to think that. So if you actually go back 2 slides, I know we're running out of time, but the one with the continuous monitoring right here, I think that in that remediate phase, there's definitely the opportunity there for learning and feeding back into the cycle. It not only feeds back into your continuous risk oversight and the KPIs you're looking at from that perspective, but it also feeds back into your initial risk checks, right? We learned something about this business that we didn't catch in our initial risk screening. We feed it back, and it's an opportunity to get better. I can always tell you, you're going to have to run those lessons learned later than when the incident occurs, because during the incident, it's going to be a little judgmental, but the dust clears and you make it. So I'll hand it back to you. Hopefully that answered the question.
No, perfectly. And I think there's one last question here from Mary. Is there a central list of federal laws and breach response needed? That certainly varies by sector. I would say that we have regulatory intelligence. We're constantly monitoring to make sure that we understand what those rules are related to. We're a highly privacy-driven organization, and a lot of breaches involve customer data, and part of that response is understanding who needs to be made aware, in what timeframes as well. And in some cases, the timeframes are very difficult to deal with, because even in breach response and understanding how significant is it, are they still there? What data did they take? That story evolves, even though you know that maybe a breach occurred. That story can go on for well past the initial requirement as far as notification to authorities relative to that breach. I know we have a couple minutes left. John, any last points that you wanted to raise?
No, absolutely. I think that on the breach response requirement and regulations, I think it's interesting, right? At least in the US, all 50 states have a data breach notification law. There's no federal one, and all 50 are different. And like you said, the timings can be different, so on and so forth. Then you get into international standards, so on and so forth. And it just becomes a whirlwind of things to look at. And that's where tools help us to respond appropriately.
Yeah, fully agree. So I know we're got 2 minutes left, but just from a OneTrust perspective, we have a full suite of third-party management capabilities. Third-party risk management really being kind of at its core of being able to understand risk relative to both vendors as well as engagements, and kind of that end-to-end workflow of managing expectations. Our third-party due diligence piece really is more for the screening at the entity layer, in partnership with Dow Jones as well, looking at sanctions and corruption and adverse media and politically exposed persons and beneficial ownership, and really understanding risk relative to the entity. And then newly launched is our third-party risk exchange, or I should say relaunched, really focused on exactly what we touched on pervasively across this discussion, was really using data, aggregating data, and being able to enable automation, risk appetite, triggers, for organizations, so that they can move somewhat away from the knee-jerk reaction for spreadsheets and assessments, and really kind of dip into data across a number of risk domains. And certainly HackNotice breach data as well as ransomware data is part of that offering as well. So I just wanted to thank John for his time and insight and wisdom. I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar, and I'll turn it back over to Gayatri to bring us home.
Yes, thanks, Matt. Thanks, John, for a great webinar today. And to our attendees, thanks for joining. If you have any questions about OneTrust or our third-party management solution offerings, you can go to onetrust.com to request a demo. We have plenty of resources there, as well as ebooks, webinars, other downloadable assets. And the recording of this webinar will be on the website in the next couple of days. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.